are my mother's.
Yes, and she's dead.
So, another iteration of Cinderella came out this year, courtesy of Jeff Bezos, I guess. Unsurprisingly, it did not strike a chord with the audience. I don't know whether it was the girl bossification of it all, the half-baked musicals, the botched vocals, or its worst crime, subjecting us to way too much of James Corden. But the thing that really rubbed me the wrong way about this movie was the claims that this particular adaptation was a feminist take on Cinderella. The insinuation that this one was somehow more empowering to girls and women than the ones that had come before. Which is incredibly incorrect because that is an erasure of one of my favorite films of all time. Ever After. A masterpiece, a movie that Drew Barrymore called a career favorite. A film with great pacing, consistent tone and direction, strong characterization, and beautifully composed frames. And more feminist than whatever this was attempting to be.
Do you want to go to that ball and meet a bunch of rich people who will change your life?
Yes, I was just crying and singing about it like 2 minutes ago.
So yeah, here's me rambling about why Ever After is the best Cinderella movie of all time. Cinderella is a folktale with countless variations across history and geography. The earliest variant known is the story of Rhodopis, told by the Greek philosopher Strabo sometime between 7 BC and 23 AD, about a Greek slave girl who marries the king of Egypt. The first published version, in Europe at least, was in 1634 in Italy. The most famous version was published by Charles Perrault in France in 1697. Who added the fairy godmother and the slipper. And though the glass slipper became the prevailing footwear, some argue that it was originally a fur slipper. The Brothers Grimm changed it to a gold slipper when they published their version in 1812. Other details also change across variations, but the central theme always remains the same. Cinderella is always the story of a persecuted heroine who, after enduring much cruelty, is lifted out of her dire circumstances into a lavish life by marrying a prince. The story has been brought to life numerous times, sometimes as opera or ballet, on theater stages, and most notably in film and television. These include musicals, period dramas, parodies, and modern retellings, or a mixture of them all. It's one of the few fairy tales that can easily be adapted to modern times, because Cinderella's struggles are tangible and relatable to many even today. It's easy to adjust the pumpkin carriage and fairy godmother to realistic elements. It's much harder to do that with, say, Snow White, and attempts at such usually fall flat. The genre of Christmas movies alone is a goldmine for Cinderella retellings, and I will lap them up every holiday season. No, there's nothing anti-feminist about wanting to escape an abusive situation, with whatever means necessary. At her core, Cinderella is a symbol for perseverance, of accepting blessings previously denied to you, of being deserving of love and comfort after a life of hardships. Someone who was treated with nothing but malice yet never lost the ability to extend love and kindness towards others or let it harden her heart. Cinderella is no different than many folktale heroes like Aladdin or Jack. Her magical solution just happens to be a prince, just like the genie in a bottle or the beanstalk. They didn't earn their prosperity any more than she did. In his article, Cinderella once had a feminist edge but men took it away, Alexander Sargent writes, "At a time when only men could be writers or artists, women used folktales as a means of expressing their creativity. Female laborers and housewives passed the stories on to one another to dispense shared wisdom, or else to break up the boredom of another working day as they toiled away, far from the prying eyes of men." Cinderella reflects these customs. It is a story about domestic labor, female violence, and friendship, and the oppression of servitude. Perhaps most significantly, it is a story about female desire in a world where women were denied any role in society. Even so, many adaptations of Cinderella have lended her a lot more agency over the years to make her more relatable to young girls. Some have done a good job of it, others haven't. Ultimately, I think it's redundant to argue whether or not a fairy tale from a time when women were barely considered human beings is feminist or not. What matters is how we take the story forward and what lessons can be gleaned from it through a feminist lens.
There is a traditionalism in this movie, yet there's a contemporary attainability, which to me for period pieces are really, really wonderful, because they do seem like separate worlds. But one of the things that ties that in and makes it relatable is, although evolution has changed, the human emotions that we all experience and go through, the desires that we have. I think the way that that Andy Tennant, the director, set it up, which is so clever, I feel, is why have the cliches been the way they were? And we sort of say that they derive from this very true story that existed in history, and that the certain like themes have come from them. Why did the stepmother hate Cinderella? What is the glass slipper aspect? Why did the prince fall in love with her on sight? And in our version, he didn't at all. It's a love story between the two of them.
Exactly.
Which I always wanted. I wanted more of the prince. I was like, who is he? Why is she in love with him? And so we answer all of those questions, and we try to take the references and the themes and answer them in a very realistic way.
I think out of all films, Ever After probably deviates from the popular Cinderella narrative the most. It plays out more like a grounded historical period piece without any magical elements. In that sense, the film takes Cinderella back to her roots, before men like Perrault, Grimm, or Disney popularized the tale with magic. Sargent continues by saying, "As the story became increasingly popular, male writers and artists became interested in adapting the tale, but in doing so, they found in Cinderella not a story of female wish fulfillment, but a more general sense of escapism. These adaptations reflected unconscious misogyny, stripping the story of much of its feminist potential and making it instead about enchantment over representation." I think what makes Ever After's premise so compelling to me is the lack of such distractions. The setting of choice is Renaissance-era France, which immediately opens it up to some interesting historical references. For example, their replacement for the fairy godmother is none other than Leonardo da Vinci. The stakes also feel higher in this version. Many often wondered why Cinderella doesn't simply run away. Other than the question of where the hell would she go, Ever After does a good job of anchoring our protagonist Danielle to her home. Because she's not alone. The help who raised her and whom she loves also work at the house, and she would never leave them behind. After all, she risks her life to save Maurice from being sold off into slavery, in a scene which touches upon another great aspect of this film, class commentary.
The power and what to do with it. What is power? And I think that the best aspect of power is that you have some leverage to make things better.
Yes,
and that's something that we talk about in this film when it comes to royalty. What a fortunate position that is to be in, not because of what is on the exterior, but because you can change the world and make it better.
In the 1550s, France was the most populated country in Europe. The rich were getting richer by trading and exploring, aka colonizing, the New World. But peasants in rural areas continued suffering due to bad harvests and medieval farming techniques. If that wasn't bad enough, France's disastrous military escapades at the time resulted in increased taxes for farmers to replenish funds. Danielle's father's estate has fallen on hard times in the hands of her stepmother, Radmilla, who secretly sells off items in the house to maintain her lifestyle, and then pretends to know nothing about it so she can deduct the staff's salaries. Throughout the movie, Danielle points out the class divide to Prince Henry, who seems oblivious to it. A constant reference in the movie is Danielle's favorite book, Utopia, by Thomas More, a satire about a utopian society that many interpret as being in support of socialism. Having said that, many also think it's an argument against socialism. It's just a really confusing book, okay? I find this a really fascinating angle to include in a story about Cinderella. To go beyond just the obvious difference in social status between a prince and a maid and comment more widely on social reforms. It's not like the film denounces the monarchy completely. Danielle does end up a future queen, but it's more about how the powerful can and should use their resources and platform to do good.
Who could think of all the wonderful things you could do for your country, for the world? You have been born to privilege, and with that comes specific obligations.
Another benefit of magic being absent is that the classic Cinderella trademarks are given a more personal connection. The dress and the slippers happen to be Danielle's mother's, rather than being conjured by the fairy godmother. That's why the idea of Marguerite taking them for her own leaves an emotional impact. That's why Danielle finally wearing them during her Cinderella moment at the masquerade means so much more. It signals a reclamation of her identity. Cinderella both is and isn't a love story. A key aspect of the fairy tale is of course that Cinderella and the prince fall in love, he searches for her, finds her, and then they marry and live happily ever after. Yet the focal point of this folktale is always the heroine, with very little time actually spent between her and her prince. And that's precisely what much of the feminist criticism of it tends to focus on. In the article, The Ever-Evolving Feminism of Cinderella, Anya Critterton writes, "There's certainly an argument to be made that most of these stories ending in cis heterosexual marriages, usually by default if not a more compelling reason, as the entire end goal for women is a detriment to them. The lack of creativity in these happy endings, stubbornly clinging to more traditional and outdated views of gender, domesticity, and ambitions is the core flaw of such stories, rather than marriage or anyone's personal version of femininity." So naturally, filmmakers have sought to remedy that in recent years, with many attempting to give more substance to the love story. Personally, I think none of them manage it better than Ever After.
Usually another cliche in the fairy tale is, and the prince fell in love with her on sight. And although that's wonderful, it's not who a person is. It's always what's inside that counts. And in our version, the prince and Cinderella really get to know each other.
I came to rescue you.
Rescue me. Commoner.
Sure, a lot of recent movies have them meeting before the ball, but oftentimes it amounts to nothing more than instant attraction that escalates to love fairly quickly. Ever After takes its time building a solid bond between Danielle and Henry, a bond that starts with them simply being intrigued by one another, which leads to them meeting again and again in different situations, each time learning more about each other, challenging each other's perspectives, and eventually realizing that they've fallen in love by the time of the ball. Yet Ever After once again deviates from the original trajectory at this turn in the story and uses this as an opportunity for character growth, which I'll come back to later. Ever After takes great efforts to develop and expand the love story beyond its original intent that makes it believable and aspirational. It also helps that Drew Barrymore and Dougray Scott have insane chemistry. I can't help but feel that Cinderella adaptations that came after have used Ever After as a blueprint. The characterization in Ever After is by far what makes it stand out as a Cinderella adaptation, and what makes Danielle stand out as a Cinderella. For one thing, she has a fleshed out life and personality. In all fairness, I do think they tried to do something similar in other films, I just don't think the result is quite as good. I think the best part of this movie is that it condemns the one thing that really bugged me about the Disney live-action Cinderella: toxic positivity.
I forgive you.
What does forgiveness even mean when the culprit isn't apologetic? I often see opinions floating around about how kindness is what makes Cinderella a feminist icon and worthy of a happy ending. Harboring ill feelings towards your abusers and wanting them held accountable does not take away from your kindness, and I love that Ever After validates that.
I want you to know that I will forget you after this moment and never think of you again. But you, I am quite certain, will think about me every single day for the rest of your life.
How long might that be?
All I ask, your majesties, is that you show her the same courtesy that she has bestowed upon me.
In the end, Danielle is ready to move on with her life and be happy, but she makes it clear that her stepmother and stepsister won't go unpunished. She can forget, but she can't forgive. Danielle also exhibits agency in a way that shows her resourcefulness and subverts genre tropes. Not only does she rescue the prince in a clever and hilarious scene, but she's also the one to save herself and win freedom in the end using her own skills, before the prince even proposes. Speaking of the prince, this is the best written one across the board. While the others also start off defiant to an arranged marriage, they don't really have any flaws to overcome. Henry goes from a conceited brat to someone who has immense emotional growth and social responsibility. I mentioned the masquerade scene before as an opportunity for character growth, and that's because while this is usually the part of the story where Cinderella and her prince dance and fall in love, Ever After chooses to make this the moment where Danielle and Henry have a falling out. After Rodmilla exposes Danielle, Henry's furious that she's been dishonest with him, and chastises her in front of everyone. The script doesn't make his growth smooth and linear. His arrogance and privilege are still obstacles he needs to unlearn. Later that night, Henry chooses to reevaluate his own perspective and behavior, thus changing into the better man Danielle has encouraged him to become.
Actually, I came to beg your forgiveness. I offered you the world, and at the first test of honor, I betrayed your trust.
This is a movie that even gives the fairy godmother a life and subplot outside of helping Cinderella. And what makes Da Vinci such a great replacement for the fairy godmother is that he becomes a friend of Danielle and Henry. He knows and understands them both, so when he roots for them, there's a sense of personal attachment. And can we just talk about how incredible Angelica Houston is as the wicked stepmother? She manages to be cold, cruel, campy, and yet humanizes Rodmilla in a way that doesn't make the central villain of the fairy tale come across as cartoonishly evil. Abusers are often respectable, socially celebrated people who show their true colors behind closed doors.
You are the only mother I have ever known. Was there a time, even in its smallest measurement, that you loved me at all?
How can anyone love a pebble in their shoe?
I want to take this moment to say that Whitney and Brandy's Cinderella is a very close second for me. Yes, I know it's called Roger and Hammerstein's Cinderella, but really it's Whitney and Brandy's Cinderella. I love that they did actual colorblind casting, I love the whimsical feel, and I love to see these two women in one frame. But in the end, the details in Ever After win out for me. It's a Cinderella film that has stood the test of time and is always the first thing I think of when I hear about feminist retellings of Cinderella. It somehow managed to be more progressive in the 90s than any of the current feminist media. It's at times satirical, but always sincere and never condescending towards the tropes it subverts. It's also a hearty reminder of why mid-budget studio films need to make a comeback.
You, sir, are supposed to be charming.
And we, princess, are supposed to live happily ever after.
Says who?
Do you know? I don't know.
What are your thoughts on Ever After and the other Cinderella adaptations? Or just the story of Cinderella in general? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.